Hi everybody. This is What is Metamodern Conversations. I'm Linda Ceriello. I'm an academic researcher.
I'm Greg Dember. I'm an independent researcher on metamodernism.
And we have a website, whatismetamodern.com, that catalogs instances of metamodernism in the arts and in culture. Recently, we had our 10-year anniversary of What is Metamodern. Woohoo! We have around 100 plus articles on various topics, various cultural artifacts. And to date, we have exactly one article on whatismetamodern.com that focuses on a video game. And that is Meredith Passahouse. She was a guest author for us, and she wrote on the game Little Inferno. And the reason we only have that one is really because video games is a topic around which Greg and I don't have expertise. Far from that, we barely know actually what a PlayStation even is. That's how out of it we are in terms of video games. But we've often suspected that video games and the culture of gaming have strong associations with metamodern sensibilities, or maybe even more than that. Maybe that's an understatement. We're just not in that culture ourselves. So we stand to learn a lot from our guests today. So let's introduce them now. I'll say just a little bit about each one of you. Simon Radchenko. We became aware of Simon's work around the time we had actually commissioned another author, Jen Cardenas, to write an article for our website based on a conference presentation she did at the Popular Culture Association on the Spider-Verse in 2020. So she wrote an article for us, and she uses Simon's framework of 5 metamodern qualities that he developed a couple of years ago, which we may talk about a little bit more later. Perhaps that will come in. And Simon's coming to us from Italy?
Ukraine, but no, it's Norway.
Oh, now you're in Norway. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Simon's a Ukrainian scholar of archaeology with a sort of side gig of writing about metamodern literature. And so then we have Gage Smith. Gage has done some wonderful graphic design for What is Metamodern, and is one of the earliest members of our Facebook group, Metamodernism in the Arts and Popular Culture. And we've just really appreciated Gage's insights and perspectives that with respect to a variety of cultural forms. So we're really glad to have Gage here with us.
Thank you.
And Scout is also a member of that group, our Facebook discussion group. And Scout has a blog or Substack, The Oscillator Stone, that explores the intersection of metamodernism and the esoteric. And we're really glad to have Scout here with us today too.
So to the viewers, I just want to suggest, if you do not feel like you're very familiar with the notion of metamodernism, we hope that it'll kind of unfold through the discussion, but we're not going to give a 101 here, but we are providing some links in the show notes. So we recommend you check those out. And actually, I even think that just amongst all of us here, we should maybe try to kind of set the stage by seeing what do we really all mean by metamodernism, and specifically in relation to video games.
Okay, yeah, so I can start with that. To me, and I guess like we agree on this starting point that metamodernism is a structure fill-in that has been introduced to us in 2010, but has been around before. That's something that is new to 21st century, and it is it presents itself in like several specific components of that fill-in. Yeah, to me that would be the certainty of need for new desire for creating new structures. So for desire to construct after the postmodern desire to deconstruct, yeah, or desire to reconstruct something, which needs the team of people, the group of people to do it. So that's how social desire, structural desire for being together evolves, and the tool for make people being really together as a society, as a group, is this new affect, the return of emotional affect and the emotional connectivity between each other, which leads to the naivety and emotional openness, so-called new sincerity. But as postmodern sensibility shows us that every construction attempt is actually not as good as we think about it, metamodernism is a constant oscillation between the skepticism and optimism here and there. And what we expect from metamodern in video games is that we expect to see it in the plot, in the narrative elements, but also in the gameplay mechanisms and in all surrounding art products, which would be visual arts, musical arts, this and that. And that's it.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think of both Greg's phrasing of what metamodernism is, and then I'm slightly less familiar with Linda's work. But I think of them both as Denver, you frame metamodernism as being it manifests through a drive to protect the interior of individuals, and then Linda, you seem to focus on specifically things like agency and immanence of the felt experience. And when I think of video games, I think of especially the people who grew up with video games. They started playing video games as children. There is a sort of mechanism in video games. It's very immersive, and I think video games, at least the ones that I've played that are more recent, they've become even more immersive, and they've become even more almost like a co-regulatory device for the individual. And so there's something there about deepening into the interiority as you play a video game. Not all of them necessarily have a metamodern sensibility, but I do think they can be or have been a driving force of this affect that we call metamodern. So it's my perspective on it.
I think one thing that I just realized that's kind of a premise of this whole conversation that we should make explicit, if everybody agrees, is I think we're exploring the idea that video games have evolved, at least in many cases, to become more metamodern. So we're going to highlight, hopefully, certain games that you all feel are examples of this move. And so it just realized that we never really said that. So
yeah, there's a point in the history of the development of video games at which there's a metamodern turn, if you will, within the video game development. Interestingly, though, too, as I've been doing my background reading, I'm sort of tempted to say that video games sort of writ large may have sort of a priori built-in metamodern elements if we take as metamodern to mean things like taking on a different persona, learning about, focusing on, even sometimes acting through the being of another person. But then I kind of want to problematize that too, because it's what about if the motive for doing that is to learn how to attack or to take somebody down, to learn enough about someone to know how to destroy them? Is that metamodern? I don't know. And then acquiring and deploying empathy, it's a related point. It could be a force for good, but it might not. Yeah.
In my view here, if I may, there's a strong need to distinguish, to tell the incorporation, or immersion into video games from this metamodern passing the agency thing. Because every video game tends to provide the incorporation, tends to want us to be there in video game, but not always it is all about, it is not always connected to this agency theme or metamodern concepts. This may be done for postmodern sensibility, or for, I would not say pre-postmodern sensibility because it's too early, but anyways, for other sensibility than a metamodern one, even in 2023.
Okay, so you certainly can have a modern or a postmodern kind of narrative and purpose and goal and such. Is that what you mean within the video game?
Yes, even though we tend to think that incorporation itself is metamodern, but that I would say that would be a simplification of it. Because and after all, incorporation is a narrative structure, yeah, and all of these narrative structures, they have been around for 1,000 years, and metamodern is around for, God save if 20 years.
Mm. Yeah, so I would love to hear if you all have examples of video games that you think are especially exemplary of the metamodern sensibility and show a difference from what may have come before and been less metamodern.
I'd be willing to do that.
Okay.
So the game that I brought was Journey, which came out in 2012. And the reason that I first thought of it when talking about metamodernism in video games was that when it came out, it felt particularly different from a lot of the other games that came out around the time, and especially 2012. I feel like a lot of the most popular games were things like shooter games, where the relationship between you and other people was either if you were either allies or you were adversaries, and the object was to destroy the other person, and it was a competition. But Journey is a game that is about. Do you mind if I just go right into the full description?
I mean, I don't mind.
All right, yeah. So Journey is a game where you it's a narrative game without dialogue. You wake up as a robed, faceless figure in a vast desert, and the only thing that you can see to move towards is this giant mountain off in the distance with this crevice at the top with some sort of divine white light coming out of it. And so naturally the player will start walking towards it. And as you walk towards this mountain, you come across these ruins where you, without dialogue, are learning this story via the art adorned on the walls of these ruins of like an ancient civilization. It tells the story of a civilization of robed figures that look just like yourself, and it tells about their civilizations like rise and fall. That the fall that came about via like mutually self-assured destruction. And as the game progresses and you move towards this mountain, the game sort of imbues this sort of religious significance to this journey that you're making, as if like what you're doing by moving towards this mountain is less of just the player being interested in it, but maybe has some sort of additional meaning or significance. Like you are, by going on this journey, that something might come about as a result. And that maybe you are doing something that, just has some greater significance to maybe this civilization that has fallen. And what seems particularly metamodern to me about it is that, spoilers, by the end of the game, it's not a very long game. By the time that you reach this mountain, the music begins to swell and you're slowly working your way towards this crevice, and the screen begins filling with light, and it cuts to credits, and then it shows your character turning into like a beam of light and a star that goes up into the sky. And as the credits roll, that star flies all the way back to the desert, the place in the desert that you started the game at, and then you wake back up again in the desert. And as a take on the hero's journey and like the monomyth, I feel like maybe a more traditional version of that story would be one where the hero overcomes the obstacle, reaches the mountain, and at the end there's some reward, or that society is rebirthed, or whereas a postmodern one might show the character in this like nihilistic cycle, where there's no reward at the end, and there's no meaning to it, and therefore that's bad, or that there's some kind of deconstruction happening. Whereas with this, you can continue playing and continue through the cycle, but it never loses its feeling of like significance and meaning and value in the act of going along this journey, and that feels particularly metamodern to me. Another like really important aspect that I feel like is Metamodern is the way that the game handles multiplayer, because you don't get to, unlike most games where there are servers and you can link up with your friends or you meet people. As you go along, sometimes another character will just pop up, another robed figure, and it's pretty random. They'll just connect you with another person that happens to be playing and is in the same area as you at the same time. And you don't know anything about them. You don't know their username. You don't know where they're from, and you can't communicate via your microphone. They decided that the best way for you to interact would be to have, there's just a couple buttons entirely dedicated to just making chirping sounds that have no particular significance except for what you and the other person prescribe in that moment. And so a lot of times, as you're playing with this person, and sometimes that connection between the two people can exist throughout the entire journey up the mountain. Sometimes they might disappear and another person might come in its place. But you two sort of create meaning and significance in the way that you're communicating together, which I think is pretty beautiful. But I think that there's something particularly metamodern about the way that it handles this issue of connection online for video games can be particularly toxic. With the more tools you give people to communicate, and the more you know about the other person as well, like the easier it is to divide. And I think it's a really interesting solution to give the players the agency to form new kinds of connections over the internet through a limitation in communication. I think that's pretty neat.
I'm curious, Gage, when you played it or the first time you saw one of these other people, was it clear to you that it was an actual player rather than a non-player character built into the game?
I don't remember what my first experience was doing that, but I do know that for a lot of people, it was a surprise to them that like they thought the entire time that it was just another character in the game. And it wasn't until you find out the other person's username during the end credits. And so it'll tell you all the people that you had played with. And for some people, that was the realization that that was another person, which is neat.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that, I mean, you're talking about this aspect of the game being something that emphasizes connection and maybe a healthier way for people to interact through the internet. But also, when we speak of metamodernism as often involving oscillations between postmodern features and, so-called modernist features. So I think the thing you're describing, it has a postmodern tinge to it as well, in that it's playing with and disrupting your expectations for like how a game is supposed to work. Like it's kind of undermining the the distinction between non-player characters and player characters, and like you said, it's using limitation in order to cause a thing, and so so metamodernism is not simply the adoption of like positive affirming things. It's like that in oscillation with, or in some kind of relation with, disruptive or questioning or challenging context, et cetera, et cetera. And I hear that in the way you're talking about this game.
Exactly, yeah.
I really like the idea that it's taking a highly technical, enterprise to create a landscape and a sense of simplicity, language at its very start, making language itself this really personal act rather than this whole sociocultural thing, breaking up the idea of signifiers at all. And again, using limitations. That just sounds almost like an intertextual interweaving in itself. And granted, haven't played the game, only have just read a little tiny bit about it. I was reading an article by Lewis Gordon talking about how Journey, 10 years from the time of the publication of this article, not sure what that date was, made a convincing case that video games could be art. That's the thrust of this article. But a couple of the main points seemed highly metamodern, and one of them was that these decidedly emotional games started to occur with Journey as one of the early ones that inspired people to, quote, forego violence and point scoring for matters closer to the heart. And someone else described it as feelings porn. There was a quote, it said, the legacy of these games, including Journey, resides more in how they collectively pushed a different emotional, intellectual, and aesthetic agenda to the mainstream. That sounds like they're talking about metamodern aesthetics.
Scott, it looked like you had your hand up.
Yeah. Well, I just was thinking, so I actually was originally going to talk about Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but and where the conversation seems to be going, I'd actually like to bring up not necessarily a video game, but a computer game, which is like a 2D fighting game called Shiner. Shiner is feels relevant to not only what we're talking about here in terms of the this post-violent way of being on the internet, but an earlier kind of question, Linda, that you brought up in regards to the counterpoint of like, it's not, video games are not necessarily inherently metamodern, though they have these qualities that we consider that are also qualities of metamodern things. Particularly the act of learning about someone to take them down. And so Shiner is a fighting game, which, when I was a kid, my cousins would play Super Smash Brothers. And the whole point of Super Smash Brothers is just to take the person down. And, even classic fighting games, it's just about strategy and winning, And so Shiner is interesting because it actually uses fighting to create connection with the non-player characters. And I actually refer to it as an example of the existentially metacute, because you play as this rabbit, this blue, crudely drawn rabbit called Fang, and Fang gets bullied. And that's kind of how the game starts, is there's this bully called Bully who walks around smashing things, and Fang is born from this egg and immediately gets beat up by this bully. Wow. And other people kind of witness the incident and they go, that's not cool. In our culture, like, you have to get someone's consent before fighting them. And so fighting is like a way of building friendship and also sharing wisdom. Fang kind of goes through this journey of learning to fight. And for every person you fight, if you win, you get to kind of like collect these different fighting moves from the people. It's like your way of bringing them into yourself. So you kind of copy their moves if you win. And it's this journey of Fang trying to find this bully to figure out why the bully beat him up. And so he's kind of like assuming that there's this deeper reason. And as he goes on this journey, each person that he fights gives him this like life wisdom. Sometimes it's really quirky and silly, like there's a character called Red who's like, why is your name Fang? You don't have a fang. And it's just this kind of like silly, the next time you fight him, he goes, I like your name, even though he teased him the first time about his name. There's this worm that has created his own religion, and Fang challenges that, and he's like, why? You just made all of that up. What's the point? And the worm says, everything is just something somebody decided was real. What do you decide? Which feels like a very metamodern little piece of wisdom to get from like a cartoon worm.
Yes.
And at the end, again, spoiler alert, at the end, Fang finally does find the bully and doesn't necessarily want to fight the bully. He just says, why did you do it? And the bully says, I don't know. And Fang is kind of crushed. He's like, he thinks there needs to be this meaning, this reason why, in order for his journey to make sense. But in the end, he challenges the bully to the fight, and the bully says, I decline. And you get an option at the very end of the game, on whether to fight him anyway or respect him and walk away. And so every time you play the game, you get to make this decision, this choice of are you going to respect this person's agency, or are you going to get revenge? And it doesn't moralize your decision. It doesn't punish you. It just gives you this choice that has so much existential weight to it. Especially given, I'll send you guys the images and you'll probably laugh how intentionally poorly drawn these characters are. So yeah, that's Shriner. The mechanics are very entry level. They're very, like, if you ever played addicting games when you were like 8 years old on the computer, you can figure out how to, it's just like 4 buttons. And
Sounds
so
like we might be able to handle that.
Speaking of mechanics, something, Simon, that you said when you were introducing the relation between metamodernism and gaming is, I think you said that we should be looking for the metamodern qualities, not just in the narrative of the game, but in its mechanic and in its visual and musical and, all of its aesthetic qualities. And I wondered if you wanted to say more about that, and maybe in relation to a particular game, if you have one in mind.
Yeah, I have one. That's the last obvious example of 2 I have. That would be the recent Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding.
Okay.
Because, well, obviously it's a bestseller, whatever game award 2019, and it's very significant in terms of metamodern message the game provides. There's a lot of, well, the post-apocalyptic world with the time falls and the America collapsed in parts and seeks for reunification. People are hiding underground from this time falls, and the non-human, neither dead nor living beings that are trying to occupy the land just because they are not really welcome in the afterlife. And well, I'm really simplifying the thing because the game has 11 hours of only the plot story videos, so it would be too complicated to retell it right now. But the point is, there's United States that seek unification, and there's the main character who is the carrier of goods between these underground cities, the underground locations, and basically he provides a connection between different locations, and this moves him in the plot from the starting point to the end point, where he crosses whole America from east to west and unites cities in one network, which they use terms like network and use the concept of bridge, to create this network. Basically, the second name of this guy, the protagonist, is Sam Bridges, so he's very clear in what he will do with United Cities of America, as they call them. And so the whole plot is this assignment of unification. But what is good there is the gameplay things that happen in there. First is the specific kind of multiplayer option, which means that you are playing games simultaneously with different people, random ones on the server, and you have a power, as well as they have the power of constructing some objects in the world that are shared in the server, but these objects meant to simplify the path between different cities. So once you constructed them, everyone you connected to on the server can use them and can reward you with likes, or any likes is the currency in the game that increases your score, but also gives you more resources to perform better in the game. So the important thing is that by doing something that is not meaningless, but that has been already passed by you, you're simplifying the game to other people. And thus you all create the large world of United Cities of America together to make the game smoother and easier for everybody. So that's the power of this constructing society, a society that constructs a common being, a common world together. That's a very metamodern thing to me. And there are many other things. For instance, there is a gameplay tool, the device that is they call bridge babies. Bridge babies are neither living nor dead babies that have a special connection to this not afterlife, and they are used as a tool, as a device to know better what's happening in the world in some risky situations. And if the guy, this Sam Bridges, the carrier, is not gentle enough with this jar where the bridge baby is located, the baby starts to cry. And to calm it down, you need to provide a specific gentle move of the touchpad or wherever, to make the bridge baby happy. And then the game starts playing with that. For instance, they take your bridge baby to repair it for some missions, for some hours of gameplay, and that's the point where gamer actually realizes how useful this partner was, how important it was, though other characters repeatedly saying that this is just a device, don't be emotional about him. But game kind of pushes you to be emotional about this thing.
That sounds again a little like the theme of valuing of simplicity. So these babies are something that is highlighted as, it might be it's pre-verbal, right? But symbolically giving us a sense of newness and of a brand new beginning and those sorts of things. And that's the highly valued kind of commodity, but it's also like a commodity, right?
Yeah, and also that's a very simple instance specimen to be affected with. Yeah, the one you can easily emotionally relate. So that's great. You're definitely passionate about this one, and this is what games tries to do. What game tries to do to make you emotional about this other agents, other characters. Yeah, including these devices. Yeah, British babies. So that's what I mean by the gameplay mechanics. Yeah, the gameplay tools that are metamodern by their nature. And basically, I'm describing something that you not experience through the plot, but you experience it through your actions in video games. And that's something that is unique to video games and not to the cinema or books. So that's something I really think we really should pay attention to when we're playing games or studying them through metamodern perspective. This is unique.
Yeah, just to follow up on that really quick, because I'm actually staring at a quote from you that I really liked from your article on metamodern gaming literary analysis of The Last of Us. And you said, you made the point that video games are a kind of cybertext and that requires the reader to develop the story. It opens new horizons for interaction with the described world, the heroes, and the plot. And unlike literature or cinema, the characters are never alone, as the player usually knows that they can change something according to their own ideas. So they know they're an agent within that. But then you also, so that makes me go, oh, metamodern, video games are really metamodern in a general sense. I want to like keep exploring that idea. But then you also gave the example of cybertexts, like really ancient ones, like the Book of I Ching or something.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say in terms of methodology. Yeah, that when we say cybertext, which is a great concept, cybertext and incorporation, they're wonderful, but you can basically apply them to some texts that are 1,000 years old. That's just a narrative strategy. And narrative strategies, basically you can find them wherever they are, in postmodern, modern, pre-modern, wherever. And it's kind of strange to say that some narrative strategy is exclusively metamodern. Yeah, so that's why I announced this cybertext, but not really use it because I'm afraid to be methodologically vogue about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really glad to, I mean, that idea really struck me because, yeah, as somebody who looks into ritual and myth and religion, because that's my field, and especially for Scout too as well. This idea, I mean, esotericism really hinges upon the use of texts in a way that one engages them and interprets them, things like that. So that's a really good thing for us to think with, this idea.
And also, in just a short addition to that, that really resonates to what I read through today in Scott's paper on music in Legend of Zelda. That this is an example of intertextuality, but not the postmodern one, but this affective, emotional, metamodern one. So intertext is something that has been around for 1,000 years, but there's difference in how we use it. Yeah. So, and that's also a very good way to detect actually metamodernism, yeah, or to like explore it through this evolution of narrative strategies. Like this is not that intertextuality, but this is that intertextuality. That's sorry, yeah.
Well, so I want to explore, and we might not have time to truly unpack this, but I really do want to explore the relationship between video games, and perhaps not that video games are inherently metamodern, but that something about video games increases the chance that the affect takes this metamodern turn, as you phrased it earlier, Linda. And I do think the emphasis on the agentic and the interior is there, perhaps not in an explicitly metamodern way, with the medium of video games. And this could have something to do with just like Digimodernism and technology in general, and how it's kind of, I wouldn't say that, say, the smartphone is an inherently metamodern structure, but something about engaging with a smartphone in one's formative years, as many of people of my age have done, I would say tilts one in a metamodern direction, more so than someone who may not have grown up with that kind of technology. I mean, you're constantly looking at yourself to the point where the self is like in some ways overly real and in other ways less real. And there's something kind of metamodern about inhabiting that half dissociative, half immersive space. Having a smartphone kind of emphasizes that. I would say video games have that, even the ones that I would consider to be more postmodern, like say Ocarina of Time, in keeping with the kind of Zelda theme, which, you know, the juxtaposition between a game like Ocarina of Time, which has a sort of fragmentation to it, and the more recent Breath of the Wild, which gives you so much agency over not necessarily the story, but the way in which the story unfolds. There's a definitely an obvious difference in regards to like epistemes between those, but there's something about the Ocarina of Time and the people who grew up playing it that likely contributed to this metamodern turn that we're more broadly seeing.
That makes sense. It occurred to me when you're talking about smartphones, that also, like, with a smartphone, you're carrying around this little box that's full of narrative of, you know, whether it's your Instagram or, somebody might you might be talking to a person in real life about a subject, and you can go on Wikipedia and get like the story about it all kind of interpolated with the reality that you're actually in. And I could see how if you grew up with having those narrative boxes around, that might contribute to a different mindset than if it's something you acquired later in life.
Also, I think there's an interesting moment, issue, how the game developers are now starting to play with this incorporation thing. Yeah, with incorporation into the process. Like the good example would be the Last of Us scene, but not the first one, which is really metamodern in terms of plot, but not proposes anything specific in terms of gameplay mechanics. But the final part of the first one, and maybe the whole second part, the whole part 2 of The Last of Us, is playing with what they call a negative affect thing, when the game basically pushes the incorporated player to do what incorporated player don't want to do. And it goes to that ridiculous point where the game received a ton of critics because players didn't enjoy the process of playing. It was emotional torture to them, with really a great feeling that what they do in terms of vengeance or whatever they do there is ridiculous and meaningless. And with this, on the one hand, the game became really controversial, but on the other hand, it proved the point of useless vengeance as a useless thing by giving a direct emotional perception that you don't want to do this. And that's an interesting way to play with this incorporation, control playing.
That strikes me as someone who I saw the TV series and have not played the game. But I feel like the TV series is full of moments like that where the protagonists are just almost destined to do something that they wouldn't want to do. And so maybe that's even just true in most other forms besides gaming. Like, if you're reading a novel, the characters are forced to do things that they might not want to do because the novel goes a certain way. And so if you're making, I'm just speculating here, but if you're trying to take games and make them more like other kinds of art, then you actually maybe do have to force the player to do things
so
they don't want to do.
I can comment on that.
Yeah.
On the first part, the final of the part one, that's the most iconic thing in terms of what you're saying, because spoiler alert, yeah, Joel wants to save Ellie.
Yeah.
Because he knows or suggests that she'll not become world saver because it's impossible to create a vaccine. And he kind of knows that Ellie don't want it. And he knows that he needs to kill a lot of people. And still he's doing it. He's saving her because it's important for him to save Ellie. Yeah, because Ellie is basically his kind of daughter. And the game plays with this in a perfect way because first, by the time this happens on the screen, most players really felt in love with Ellie because Ellie is nice. You're making a long road with her, and it is great to be connected with her. And on the other hand, you need to choose between saving her and saving the whole world. And when I discuss this moment, this plot twist with my high school students, they all say that basically it's better to save the world than save one girl. But the game don't give us a choice to do this. We do what Joel wants to do. And we need, as we are playing for Joel, we do what he wants to do with his hands, not what we want to do. Just because he thinks it's right. It's obviously in Tolstoy novels from 19th century, it works exactly like that. Like Anna Karenina works in this specific way. She wants to act, and then she's fallen under the train. Again, spoiler alert. Yeah, but here with video games, you're first-hand experience pushing Joel to do what you don't want to do, and it's really impressive.
So all three of you, I think, at some point gave a spoiler alert apology. And I'm curious also, Gage, I think you talked about playing the game over many times. And so the second or third time or fourth or 25th time you play a game, like you've already experienced the spoilers yourself. So I'm just kind of curious whether there's some sense in which spoilers have a different impact in metamodern games than they do in non-metamodern games or in other art forms in general. And if that's a question someone wants to address, please go ahead. If not, You don't have
With Journey, I think it's particular because I think the main thesis of Journey is that the meaning is in the journey and not in something at the end that comes. You know, there's no big, the big reveal is that, oh, you start from the beginning again. And a lot of people do go through there aren't lots in terms of collectibles in this in the game. There's not a ton of secrets that you can get through multiple replays. You do as you start over again, you gain a new, I think, like ring design around the robe of your character. And so as you play and you meet new people, they might have a different number of rings depending on how often they've played. And I think by maybe the 8th time or 10th time that you go around, you get a white robe. But that's the only that's like the only reward that you get from playing multiple times. And so for a lot of people, I imagine it's just the experience of playing the game might be enough for them to play. I imagine, and I mean, Simon, you can tell me if I'm wrong. The relationship between Journey with spoilers, I think, is a bit different, because with Journey, I could tell you everything that happens in the game, but you're never going to know the value of it until you play it yourself, and it's that firsthand experience that's very important. Whereas with The Last of Us, that's a game that very much tries to emulate the experience of being in a cinema. Like, it's a cinematic game, and tries to be like a movie, where spoilers might be a bit more devastating to someone who's hoping to play the game.
Yeah, the thing with The Last of Us, it's obviously the spoilers are important because you can basically spoil the plot parts, but the game is this well written, you anyway want to interact with it. But yeah, as it is plot based, the story based, spoilers are very important. And obviously, as I see it, maybe I'm wrong, but as I see it, there are certain trends to introduce more repetitive gameplay games, or like boring tail games, where the process is not something that's happening in the game, but something that's happening with you playing the game, with extremely, to be honest, boring and repetitive gameplay of Death Stranding, with the processual values of playing Journey, as I got it from the example, and many other things like that.
Yeah, you wrote something, Simon, about the overcoming of boredom being a way that users of the game support each other and interact with each other to overcome the innate boredom. Is that related to what you're talking about here?
I'm not sure. Well, it has something to do with overcoming boredom, definitely, because when you simplifying the path in Death Stranding in particular, you're contributing to smoothening the road, and the gameplay goes faster and smoother, and it's not that repetitive and not that challenging in the way you don't want it to be challenging. So yes, by helping other people, you help yourself to have less struggle through the gameplay. But that's not always the point, I guess. Like that, it's definitely this in the Death Stranding case. I guess in other cases it might be different.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of latched onto that idea because I just thought about, that's a different kind of aesthetic situation of actually overcoming boredom within a video game, because it's so technically complex. Again, there's so much going on. And then I'm just fascinated how the choices of the game makers can be to simplify, you know. I had something I wanted to return to, or feels like maybe this notion of simplicity keeps coming back for me. And this relates to sort of the plot or the game setup as metamodern. And I thought of it when Scout was talking about Shiner. So I was watching this video by a woman named Leighton Gray, who is a content creator of dating simulation games. She's giving a presentation at a game design conference. And the conceit is kind of like she's teaching people about the landmines involved in designing for, if you're a 30-something or older content creator, and you're trying to anticipate what's going to be seen as cool or popular for younger audiences, and how that can be sometimes difficult. And so she's describing how it's important to understand metamodernism as the current structure of feeling.
And she says metamodernism, right?
And she identifies it. She says metamodernism. Yes, she links it back via Luke Turner as an artist who created that metamodern manifesto that so many people read over a decade ago, I guess at this point. Anyway, but she's talking about that there's this common technique of the setup of a video game or even an app that is where it's looking kind of like very lighthearted, or like it's going to be an ironic kind of treatment. So one of her examples is some app where people date birds. And so it's like setting the player's expectations really low with something silly or weird, and then doing what she calls a bait and switch. Partly because I think she has one foot in the postmodern, one in the meta, but she says a bait and switch because she says it's really hard to tell a serious story at face value on the internet, which we can all sort of interpolate that through the epistemes of, pre-modern to modern literatures, grand narratives, heroes' journeys, and then the postmodern reaction to those. But so I just wondered if this is something that that strikes people as a technique of setting up something really, I don't know if it's boring, but it's like simple, it's meta cute, it's little, it's light, and then interweaving all this existential stuff. I mean, we've already kind of mentioned that that's happening, but I wondered if people can speak to whether that's a very widespread thing that in what you might think of as metamodern video games.
This is not what you asked, but I can sort of think of a counterexample. Part of the reason why I wanted to talk about multiple video games, and I'll try to make this brief, is because Shiner is kind of example of that, the existentially meta-cute, whereas something like Breath of the Wild, which is in the Legend of Zelda greater series, is almost like a metamodernization of a series that typically has very heavy content. Typically, it's about Breath of the Wild is in terms of its narrative is kind of what happens if Link fails, which isn't really, something that is experimented with that much in other games. And so you're kind of put through this post-apocalyptic world that's absolutely gorgeous, but it's like a destroyed Hyrule that's totally gorgeous. And the sort of tiny is not emphasized in the game, but then when it's marketed as this epic tale of through a destroyed Hyrule, and for many people it's the Hyrule of their childhoods because they've replicated certain environments from previous games. So there's that intertextual weaving of, hey, remember this? Remember when you were a kid? And so the kind of tiny aspect is hidden. It's hidden in these little moments where you come upon for example, like the ruins of Lon Lon Ranch, which you would only remember if you played like a previous game, or in these sort of mini games that you play, it's juxtaposed, like trying to think, there's like a snow bowling mini game that you can play that is very lighthearted, that they don't lead with that. They lead with this epic kind of post-apocalyptic. So it's sort of the reverse of what you're talking about. It's still a bait and switch. You don't expect to play these quirky, weird mini games or have these side quests that are so lighthearted and such a heavy game. But I don't know. Something about that feels almost equally as metamodern, but from the opposite angle.
Yeah.
I think I have a ridiculously evident example of what Scott just told, because I find it ridiculous because it will be about Witcher, the third part, the Wild Hunt, which is definitely not a metamodern game at all. You can't expect it to be because it's The Witcher. The Witcher is not about metamodernism, but in this Wild Hunt part, the ending depends on your certain decisions, and you expect the decisions to be something important about political situation in the world or your interaction with the political powers. But in fact, the final decision about whether the world would be saved or not depends on your way of interacting with this Siri girl who is gonna save the world. For instance, you're getting additional point to the good ending if you decided to play snowballs with her instead of drinking alcohol. So this is a very ridiculous example of how this serious postmodern superhero tune goes simplified. And also, I want to notice that to answer Linda's question properly, we need a lot of case studies, and we don't have them at all.
Yeah, my sampling of the ones that I know about is so tiny. That's why I was putting it out to you all as well.
That's the state of the art.
What's that?
That's the state of the art. I guess we all don't have these case studies. We just started.
Yeah.
There are games that I feel like fit the bill of what Linda's talking about. This is not a game I know a whole lot about, but I think it's been brought up in the group before, which is Undertale, which I think has been described as a metamodern game, in which you come across the way that the game is played. It's inspired by JRPGs, Japanese role-playing games like Earthbound. And the characters that you all come across are really silly, like a skeleton with like a Skeletor voice, and a puppy dog knight that his neck will just randomly extend through the screen in random shapes, and like very the way that they portray the characters at first is like very one note or ironic and detached and silly. But the way that you play the game is that in order to defeat these characters, you have to kind of learn about their quirks, and learn about their personalities, and kind of familiarize yourself with the characters in like a very soft and intimate sort of way. Again, it's not a game that I've played a lot, but I have friends who have played it a bunch, and that seems to sort of go in the way that you've described it, where it portrays itself as something very tiny and simple, but then imbues meaning.
That sounds really interesting. I kind of can't wait to play a bunch of these games now.
There was something very interesting that Greg, you said earlier, that was like a question that I had a thing I wanted to say, but I can't remember the question. So if you happen to psychically intuit what question I'm referring to.
You know what your answer is.
Yes.
Right? Okay, just tell us your answer.
I think that the nature of the spoiler, again, this might have more to do with Digimodernism than with Metamodernism, as we're kind of talking about it here. But for myself personally, growing up with the narrative box means that there are no surprises anymore. And so I'm kind of desensitized to spoilers. And again, I forget if it was Simon or Gage, one of you mentioned that a lot of video games, that it emphasizes it's not just a narrative thing, it's an experiential thing. And so you don't really know what it's like to play the game, even if you might know the story. I don't know if the spoiler thing is really, it's kind of like a just in case, because some people get like butt mad about spoilers, but for the most part, the games we're talking about are pretty old. So at this point, I would say, like, I don't think anyone's actually going to be upset about the spoilers. It's just like a compulsory thing. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay.
So it's just a really interesting component of kind of an evolution of how the importance of plot and how outcomes are treated. The relative weight of the outcome is something quite different in video games or at least from a certain subsection of video games versus, and Simon had talked about literature and film, and also maybe earlier video games. And that actually does relate to a point I was wanting to kind of, I keep on trying to kind of peck away at this idea of video gaming as a phenomenon that has contributed to the metamodern turn, maybe we can say. And there was a post in Notes on Metamodernism in which the person was trying to describe the limits of using postmodern theory from a gaming perspective. The person says that gaming has this a priori breakdown of established subject-object positions, and subsequently, and I'm quoting, the individual's freedom to play with and to freely construct their identity. And that relates just to what you were saying, Scout, I think. But the person goes back to and says this invokes Lyotard, who's a French philosopher from like the 70s, championing of the rise of the individual's little narratives in opposition to society's meta narratives dictating what the subject should believe. So video games understand things differently in terms of this active spectator, and they negotiate the meaning and interact with the narrative, control the pacing and the editing and things like that. And so those are the kind of qualities that they sound like they could be a little bit postmodern as well. So that's why I just haven't quite arrived at what my position is on this, but I want to keep exploring whether it seems postmodern or somewhat metamodern, if anyone has any comments or not.
Well, the way I want to cast it, as again, someone who's pretty much on the periphery of the experience of actually playing games, but so you could say that all games, classic first-person shooter games or whatever like that, or the games that we used to play in arcades like Asteroids and Space Invaders and stuff like that. All of those games, compared to other narrative art forms, those games all are interactive. They're a game, so of course they're interactive, and the player is an agent to a degree in the game, or to a big degree in the game. And so the potential is there for this kind of metamodern sensibility. But until they started making the kinds of games that you all are talking about, like Journey or whatever, it was just kind of latent and maybe expressing itself in a more postmodern way. Like in my classic idea of a video game, like there's no such thing as a plot twist, because you're just doing the thing, and it's very cyclical and repetitive and all that. And then so I want to believe that there is a truly metamodern turn in video gaming, and yet that turn is built on something that was latent in video games all along, but wasn't expressed. Does that make sense, Scout?
So what comes to mind is your article, Greg, Punk Rock for Sissies, where you talk about rock as a phenomenon in music in general. And then when you go into rock, you can break it up and you can kind of say, well, these particular subgenres are more metamodern, whereas these are more traditional.
Or periods,
but
even.
Yes, yeah.
So what I'm saying there, I just to get it. So what I'm saying there is rock as an overall phenomenon is a postmodern phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
But within the history of rock, you see the recapitulation of traditional rock, modernist rock, postmodern rock, and now metamodern rock.
Yeah. So I think that that exact frame doesn't necessarily fit exactly to what we're speaking about in the context of video games, but something similar is likely necessary in order to understand how video games can be a vehicle for this metamodern sensibility and possibly exacerbate its presence in our culture. I don't know what you could say that video games are in general, broadly speaking, but I do think that there's a leaning towards that metamodern in them, more so than postmodern, I would say. Even the like ones where it's Tetris, you're just doing a thing. It's so immersive, it's so self-reflexive in a way that most other mediums aren't. So comparatively speaking, that would be more metamodern relative to like a book or something.
Right.
But then if you kind of look at video games in more detail, there are ones that are explicitly more metamodern in gameplay and in plot and what have you than others, sort of similarly to how like Elliott Smith is more metamodern than like the Ramones or something.
Mm-hmm.
I think that relative to phrase is really important for us here. And you also said a phrase earlier, Scout, that I really liked, which was that there's a kind of half-dissociative, half-immersive feeling. And I think that's another kind of quality that you could apply more to some video games and less to other video games, but still in a general sense, it's at least to some extent inherent, you could argue, within video gaming, if I'm understanding kind of what you were saying.
May I also like try to, the thing I was thinking while Greg, you were asking the question. Well, first, video games are the things that made us emotionally or taught us how to be emotional about the piece of code. Yes, and they basically provided the agency to the piece of code. And this thing is something that provided the new turn into giving agency to non-human beings in this way, in their active participation in changing the life. That would, for me, be connected to the ontological term, to this Graham Harman thoughts.
Object-oriented ontology raises its head.
Yes, which I think are metamodern in their concept, and not all agree with me, but well, anyway.
I agree with you.
And then, if we remember what Alan Kirby wrote in his Digimodernism thing, that he is afraid that digital modernism era would be a cultural desert because it's not providing anything except incorporation or interactivity in digital world. So it's clear that video games are proving to be not like that. They make this interaction filled with some cultural values, artistic values, and emotional values. So in this way, I would maybe consider video games as a way to cure the digital world with the proper cultural values that were absent when Alan Kirby introduced Digimodernism in 2006.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, just to dovetail on that, I mean, within the field of religious studies, popular culture is thought of as a way of looking at public theologies, especially video games. So even an example is like even using violent gameplay as an example that engages the topic of evil, and people build models and ethical stances for themselves. So that's front and center in how games are recognized and used as or in religion in the field of religious studies.
I just had one thought jumping off of what Simon was saying, and then maybe I want to get to my last question. But Simon, when you're talking about giving agency to code, to computer code, what sprung to mind is the movie Free Guy. Have you all seen that? I know you have, Linda. Oh, well, just quickly. So it's a movie, you start off in the point of view of a guy who's like going about his day. He stops to get his coffee. The baristas know his name and say hello to him. And, he's kind of just having this very typical day. It becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that he's a non-player character in a video game. And then the development of the story is him taking agency and becoming an actual player character, not a non-player character. And then, spoiler alert, he actually eventually makes it out of the game and into reality and all of these things. So like there's a case where in the medium of film, it's reflecting on the video game dynamic and, projecting interiority into non-player characters from the video games. And I think that's interesting. And so what I do want to ask though is, and there's two parts to this question and you can answer both or either one. What from all three of your experience is the reception among game players in general to this metamodern direction? Is there resistance? Is everybody on board with it? And then the kind of inverse of that question is that for you all, now that you have this possibility of playing seemingly metamodern games, do you still enjoy the classic video games that don't have these metamodern attributes, or have you kind of moved on from those at this point because the metamodern games fulfill you so much more?
So I really like both those questions. I'm going to attempt to briefly answer both. The first one, so I am really interested in the Legend of Zelda games, in part because not all of them are metamodern, and it's fun to, like, I'm currently playing through Twilight Princess, which was the first Legend of Zelda game that I technically ever played when I was very young. And playing through it, and it's kind of like, I'm really into anime, so it's kind of like watching, people may or may not know what I'm about to talk about here, but it's kind of like watching Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is sort of like your quintessential postmodern anime, but it kind of impacted anime in such a way that anime became metamodern as a result of hating how Evangelion went. It was so depressing, it was so nihilistic, it was so fragmented and dissociative that metamodern anime just had to happen. And so I like to think of myself as being interested in, I'm currently researching the second industrial revolution, and that's kind of like, oh, modernity. I'm really interested in, I think in order to really understand metamodernism well, one has to be willing to fully inhabit the sensibility of all of these epistemes, because metamodernism kind of does that. In its sort of like quirky quest for this, like, what is the agentic and what is the personal in this age, it has to understand itself relative to everything that came before it. So there's that. And then the second, I kind of guess I answered both of them in one, so I'll just shut up now.
Well, so Gage, yeah.
Oh, sure. I think there's definitely some resistance. The first thing that came to mind, and I haven't even considered these games as whether or not they're metamodern, but there's an entire genre of game where the mechanics have all been pared down to where you're mostly roaming an environment, and maybe there's narrative unfolding. And it's sort of, I don't know if I want to say that they're all metamodern, but there's definitely a metamodern tint to these style of games that have been deemed walking simulators, mostly in a derogatory term, because gamers, many gamers like to say that there's nothing that you do in the game, there's no agency, there's just walking around, and therefore that is sort of a bad thing. So I think that there are some movements of disdain towards certain metamodern aspects in video gaming. As far as, I don't think that I consider whether or not something is metamodern before I'm able to like latch on to excitement for something. I mean, the only video game this year that I could say that I'm excited about to play is the new Spider-Man game, and I've never once thought about whether or not it's metamodern as a video game. So I would say no, there's no correlation.
And I would say that to me, and maybe to the majority of players, what is more important than metamodern, postmodern thing is the game good or not? And it's a huge problem to have like really the game. Yeah, now there's really a few plus years. So it might be the postmodern The Witcher or metamodern The Last of Us, whatever. But if it's good, it will be played and discussed. And yes, I would say that the amount of metamodern, or what I would prefer to call metamodern games, is growing, but it does not mean they are facing resistance or facing the player support or whatever. Yes, so it's just the growing number, because people who play games and also people who make games, I guess, share the same structure feeling, which is metamodernism for our time. Yeah.
So just to ask a question on that, Simon, when you say if the game is good, wouldn't the marker of whether you're going to come down on one side or another of that have something to do with the aesthetics that you're oriented toward, and what your aesthetic toleration, you might say?
Well, wait, Oh, go ahead.
Yes and no. Like, yes, if the game resonates, you'd better call it good. Yeah, you tend to call it good. But again, I will stand with same example of The Witcher, which is definitely not metamodern, but is so good. People keep playing it even 8 years after it went out, after it was released, because it's just great as a game.
Great as a game. So that has to do with other things besides the aesthetics, obviously, but you might not be able to divorce yourself from the aesthetics on some
besides
level.
the feeling, besides the cultural state. But yeah, you have the quality of main plot line, quality of sidelines, quality of quests, the graphics, the this and that, and it's not necessary, might be considered or should be considered in terms of metamodernism or postmodernism. It can just be good or bad, and it's
I
important.
mean, I feel like the same thing applies in all forms. Like, I would never want to be boxed into saying I only appreciate metamodern movies or I only appreciate metamodern music. So I think that applies, you know. I don't think that I've changed just because I like a lot of metamodern stuff and I think about metamodern stuff. That doesn't mean I've changed my definition of good to be equal to metamodern.
Sorry, I'll be short. I just mean that it's hard to answer your question about is there resistance or not, because people basically resist in video games for another reason, because they are bad, or accepting them because they are good.
Because they don't tug at your serotonin neuroreceptors quite as much as you'd like.
Yes.
To be biologically determinative. Sorry, Scout.
I could barely contain myself. I just needed to say this. I do think that, and Greg and I have talked about this actually on a podcast or two, or I don't know, maybe a personal conversation. I think in a podcast that's going to come out between you and I, we've mentioned this, that metamodern aesthetics can be more affirming for certain kinds of personalities than others. And so how you're experiencing metamodernism, you might experience video games that happen to be metamodern as good because they're particularly affirming to you and what your needs are in the narrative department and the gameplay department. It depends why you're, I appreciate postmodern things, not because they're affirming, but because they're intellectually interesting to me. Whereas I appreciate metamodern things because they make me feel more at home in myself and more in touch with myself. And so if you prioritize that as an individual, you're going to think that the games that are good are more frequently going to also happen to be metamodern. Whereas if that's not a priority for you, you might be indifferent as to whether it's metamodern or not. You might just really enjoy exercising strategy, and so you play strategy games regardless of what their aesthetic or sensibility qualities are. So I think this is kind of a difficult question to generalize, but there are multiple right answers to it, I would say.
And I think that perspective is actually a really metamodern one. It's a pluralistic kind of way of approaching it. That's an excellent model for breaking down how we think. I would love to do some kind of longitudinal study, because I'd like to get those people in there who are like maybe the old crusty, the players of the ancient games that will only play that game, and the reason why they have their reasons for that, and then other people who swear by a certain genre and what their reasons are. And I'd love to see what it highlights in their brains as well, personally.
Yeah, cool. I think there's a relationship between aesthetics and things like neurodivergence. So that could be a potentially awesome conversation to have on some other day.
oh, that's a perfect segue to a point that I wanted to make, but it was a tiny bit off topic, and now it's on topic. The woman I mentioned who did the presentation on how to write games for the internet and not embarrass yourself, and was talking about this sort of bait and switch of metamodern gaming, the setups. And she said she cited a study, and this is going to be very anecdotal here because she didn't give any reference for it, but there's a study on the sharing of content, of the sharing. So the sharing aspect of playing games, that showed that an area of the brain that lights up when the impulse to share hits a person. So this could be within your game or within your app that you're going to share content somehow. And so what happens is one is evaluating the worth, the social value, the social capital that might arise in a moment of sharing or helping create the cities, the United Cities, you know, whatever. And that it's at this temporoparietal junction of the brain. So it's at a junction, a place where two areas of the brain meet. And so she makes a kind of cheeky nods that that's the area of the brain showing physical evidence of metamodernism. And then she kind of, you know, laughs and goes off to another topic. So I was like, oh, that would just be so interesting just to watch metamodern gamers' brains, you know, igniting where at the temporoparietal junction or what have you. Something for further research.
Yeah. So shall we wrap it up? And this is the hardest part of these video conversations for me, is sounding intelligent at this point.
Well, I can definitely I feel like I have learned a lot from this conversation, and it's just enhanced my ability to think about these questions that I came in with. So I really appreciate that from all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing it all, for arranging it and inviting us. That's great to have this platform and talk about things.
Seconded.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And if anybody is watching this and you're inspired to raise any points or ask questions, we're very much interested in your comments. And I'll make sure to pass them along to our guests if you want to direct them to any of them. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.